So Sedolus contacted me and sent me a couple of their budget-friendly 2.5 10 gig network switches. And the first one that I have is just your basic 5-port, 2.5 gigabit interface network switch. It's a fanless little tiny box. As you can see, it's the size of my palm of my hand. And there's a couple vents on the side for heat to escape, and it's just 2.5 gig interfaces. There's one off to the side a little bit, and I think possibly is because how they reuse the chassis maybe with their other switch, which I'll show you in a minute. It's kind of interesting. There's one off the side. It doesn't mean anything special, because sometimes they'll put a port on the side that you can PoE power the switch, but that's not the case with this one as far as I know. It's just a basic 2.5 gig switch here. There's not much to say about a switch like this. I'm going to measure how much wattage it uses when it's just idling with nothing plugged in, and maybe I'll plug in devices on all these ports, or at least one of them, and see how much watts gets added to each port. That's something you can try out. On the back, you can see there's a DC 12 volt connection, barrel jack, and there's a nice little grounding screw. So if you have this setting in your rack, you could ground it if you really want to. So it makes sense since this case is made out of metal. It's not plastic. What I'm going to do with these switches, I'm going to have a project in mind for both of these, or at least tell you what I might use it for, and give you some examples, some ideas. I plan to use this switch when I do a Proxmox cluster, and I want to put a couple WAN interfaces and a couple nodes. So I plug my cable modem into this and a couple, like at least 2 nodes. So then if I migrate nodes, only one of the 2 nodes will be active at a time. So I could have up to 4 different Proxmox nodes sharing the WAN interface as long as one of them is active at a time. Because I'm not going to do like true high availability. I just want to be able to migrate OPNsense between different hardware that I'm currently testing, or maybe hardware that I want to reboot because I have some updates or whatever. So this little switch will be a nice little switch, because otherwise I would have to create a VLAN on my switch that only those WAN interfaces are on that VLAN, which I could do if I want to, but my cable modem supports 2.5 gigabit, and I can get a little bit more than 1 gigabit download with Comcast. So I could take advantage a little bit faster than 1 gigabit speeds if I use a 2.5 gig interface. So this switch would be perfect for that, because it's unmanaged and I don't need VLANs for that sort of thing. So this will be useful in that scenario. So I'll show you how I'll be using this in the future, because I like to try to do projects with the hardware that I get, just to try some stuff out, and that'll be pretty fun. And the next switch that I have has 4 2.5 gigabit Ethernet interfaces and 2 10 gig SFP Plus interfaces. The SFP Plus cages have these dust covers on them, so you can just take them off if you want to use them. They asked if I wanted this model or the 8-port model, but the 8-port model only has 1 10 gig interface, which it's great if you're just only interested in 2.5 gig interfaces, but you'd like having a little bit faster uplink, because you could have 4 2.5 gig interfaces saturated, or several that aren't quite saturated, and you can make use of that 10 gig interface. If you uplink it to a switch that has a 10 gig interface, you can make use of that bandwidth. You won't have a bottleneck as much with that 8-port switch. But I opted for the smaller switch that has 2 10 gig interfaces, because I think that's more interesting for me personally, because I can uplink one of these to a switch and have 10 gig to the switch, but I can also have an additional 10 gig interface for a client that I can plug into here, a server, PC, whatever, that has a 10 gig interface. So I like having the 2 interfaces so that you can get an extra one so you can connect the device to it. So it's not just uplinking. These 4 interfaces will saturate only one of these interfaces. So that's why I think this is perfect, because you can saturate the 10 gig with the 4 ports, or you can saturate it with the 1 10 gig port. But of course, if you have all of these saturating, you're not going to be able to, you'll be bottlenecked by the 10 gig interface, unfortunately, because you'll be pumping 20 gigs through, right, instead of 10 gigs. Another nice thing about this switch, it's web managed. And so at the price point that this is at, it's very similar to the unmanaged switch that I got in a previous review that I did of another brand, that this is actually cheaper, I think, currently when I looked, than the one I bought just like, sometime last year. So these things are coming down in price, and they're adding more features like web management. Because it's web managed, it means you can do VLANs, spanning tree protocol, IGMP snooping, and probably some lags on here you can do. I might use this network switch in my lab network that I've set up because I'm using the unmanaged switch just so I can have some higher speed interfaces. I can do speed tests between different devices, but I might use this one in place of the other one, or in addition to, if I need extra ports or whatever. But if I want to do VLAN testing across different interfaces at different speeds, this will be great because I can plug into some of these boxes and mini PCs I've been getting to review. I can plug them in here and test across different interfaces. One thing I noticed about both of these switches is they have a little mount here, a little screw mount on the back. Don't know if that's compatible with a VESA mount, on at least on the width of that. It looks like it might not be. It's maybe a little wider, but at least there's some screw holes here, so if you want to mount it to a wall or even under a desk. Another thing that I want to mention is there is no feet on the bottom of this. I wish these kind of came with a rubber feet, but I actually bought a pack of rubber feet that I've been using for these types of devices that I get that don't have feet, because when you have this setting on your server rack and it's just metal on metal, it just slides all over the place. So when you try to plug stuff in, it's just annoying. You kind of have to hold it. I might put a link below so you can grab some if you want to get this device. The idle temperature of the 5-port 2.5 gig switch is 1.77 watts, which is pretty good. When I plugged in all of the interfaces, I ended up getting 5.77 watts, which is exactly 4 watts, which means each port uses about 0.5 watts. For the 2.5 10 gigabit switch, I thought it was interesting that the idle power usage was a little bit lower at 1.44 watts. Similarly, when I had everything plugged in, it was still almost like 1 watt lower than the other switches. I don't know if it's just the snapshot in time I took or what, but I thought that was interesting. So I'm going to take a look at the web interface on this, and we'll see what it looks like and see what we can configure on this. I took a quick glance beforehand and looking through the documentation before I got these, just because I was curious, and it looks like it supports a decent amount of things you might want for your home network. All right, so let's take a look at the web interface for the Sedola switch. I already put a manual IP address in. The default IP address I have on the screen is 192.168.2.1. I made my system 2.10, so you can just set whatever manual IP address as long as it's not 2.1. So I'll just hit enter here, and you can see the username password is just admin by default. It's very basic. As you can see, this is a bare minimum interface. It doesn't really matter what it looks like as long as it's usable. So as you can see, it displays the default information for your IP address, MAC address, and the gateway, and all those things that are configured by default. It's on the .2 network. Okay, so I'm going to start looking at the features of this network switch. I'm not going to get into everything in a lot of detail, but I just want to show you the general idea of what features are available. I've noticed that even though this network switch looks kind of similar to my TP-Link Easy Web Managed switch, it has similar features and stuff, but I've noticed this Sedola switch actually has a lot more features than even the TP-Link Easy Managed switch that I have. I was kind of impressed a little bit with the feature set, for a budget-friendly switch such as this, because some of these features you'd normally see maybe in a smart managed switch, not just an easy smart managed switch, is what what TP-Link would call it, like a more basic smart managed switch. So let's look at the system menu, and you'll see the information is the page that we're on, basically the dashboard. IP setting, you can change your IP address. User account is the admin account, you can change the password for that. And port settings. Port settings you can change if you want to enable, disable ports. It almost looks like you can only enable or disable these groups of ports, like the 2.5 gig ports and the 10 gig ports. But I'm not sure if maybe you just click on one individual, you can disable it that way, because when you look down here at this bottom at this table, you'll see which ones are enabled or disabled. So this probably controls it individually. So let's go ahead and just try one real quick. We'll just disable this port, and I bet it only does the first port. So it's kind of, the interface is a little bit confusing because it almost looks like you're enabling and disabling all these ports, but you have to click one first to enable or disable it. So let's enable that port again, and you'll see it updates this table down here. I'm actually connected to port 4, which you can see it's the 2.5 gigabit port. And so let's go to configuration. So VLANs, you got your VLAN configuration. This is where it kind of reminds me a lot like the Easy Managed TP-Link switch, where you select these radio buttons for if you're tagged, untagged, or not a member of that VLAN. So remember, tag ports is where you're connecting between switches and switches and routers where you want multiple VLAN traffic to pass through. That's like your trunk port, you want if you want to call it that. So that's where you want to use your tag ports. And untagged is for all the clients that you want on the individual VLANs, like PCs, printers, laptops, whatever. So those sorts of things will be untagged. So next we have the VID, which is sometimes they're called PVID, which it shows it here. So basically, you just pick any ports that you want on here, and you can specify the PVID for the VLAN that you're on. If this is similar to like a TP-Link switch, I'm just kind of using it as a reference because I have some of those network switches. You might have to configure, it looks like, the PVID separate from the VLAN. So you have to assign the VLAN, and then you have to come to this page and set the PVID. I'll test that in the future and see how that works, but most likely it's similar to where it doesn't automatically change it for you if you set it as an untagged member. So that's something to keep in mind. So next up, we have quality of service controls. You have the port to queue and queue weights for each of these ports. It's very basic quality of service, but it's nice that it has some of those features, even if it's really basic. So, if you have like, voice VLANs and those kinds of things for like voice over IP phones, you can kind of prioritize traffic a little bit. So next we got loop, which you got the loop protocol, which is if you want to on or off, basically loop detection, prevention, and spanning tree. Spanning tree, if you pick that, you have these additional settings here, like this STP global and STP port. I haven't really messed too much with configuring spanning tree protocol because I don't, I make sure I don't create loops in my network by, configuring things properly. And especially, you have to be careful when you're doing like link aggregation, especially because link aggregation can create a loop if you don't have it set up ahead of time before you start plugging stuff in, right? But it's cool to see that feature in these budget-friendly switches. So IGMP snooping is a nice feature if you have IP security cameras or IPTV or other multicast devices on your network, and you want to maximize performance of your network, and you don't want to waste bandwidth sending lots of different traffic to different devices within a network. So that can really help only sending traffic to the devices that need it. It can save a lot of bandwidth depending on your network. I like to put my cameras on its own network, for example, IP cameras, and I don't really care about IGMP on that network so much because it doesn't even saturate the network in the first place, and it's isolated from everything else on my network through VLANs, the broadcast traffic. So I'm not too worried about it. Okay, next we have the trunk group settings, and this is what they're calling link aggregation. So it might be kind of weird to see this, but it looks like you can, if you hit control click, it doesn't tell you, there's no instructions on this page, but I figured out if you control click this and hit add modify for these two, it looks like it's putting these two in they're calling it a trunk group, but it's basically a link aggregation. But this must be kind of really basic because it doesn't support LACP as far as I could tell. I don't see any other settings for link aggregation. So this will probably just be basic load balancing or failover or both. It might do kind of just a basic static lag. That's what some switches call it, a static lag instead of a LACP lag. So just keep that in mind. It doesn't support LACP. So if you're connected to a switch that does, you might have to configure it in a static lag mode for that to work. But that should be fine for basic use. So let's go to port-based mirroring is the next one, and you can basically mirror ports. If you want to monitor traffic on the switch, you can connect one of the ports to packet sniffing software that you can kind of sit there and analyze that traffic. Let's go to bandwidth control. Bandwidth control is different than quality of service, but it's kind of a quality of service type of thing because you're limiting the amount of traffic going through things. Quality of service is more focused on what gets the most priority, but bandwidth control is focused more on the actual throughput that's going through the different ports. So you can specify, if you pick some ports up here, you can specify data rates for this. This could be useful if you have port 6 connected to a 10 gigabit network switch, utilizing port 5 fully, say transferring some data across the network to NAS or something. And then if any of these other ports 1 through 4 are also using the bandwidth, you would get a little bit of a bottleneck here on port 6 because it's only going to have 10 gigabits, and you could have up to 20 gigabits going through here if you had all your ports maxed out the throughput, right? So you might want to limit some of these if you're worried about throughput issues. Jumbo frame. So jumbo frames is good for if you have a NAS on here and say you have a PC in port 6 and a NAS on port 5. you want to probably, you can put them on their own network if you want, and enable jumbo frames, because you have to enable it for the entire network. In general, it's recommended to do that, so they're all using the same frame sizes. That way, you don't get fragmented frames, and it causes all kinds of issues. But it's interesting here that it defaults to this 16,383 bytes. I believe that's bytes. Normally you do 9,000, but there's some overhead, so this is saying 9216. This one's probably what you want to set jumbo frames to, so this will be a good one to hit apply and save this change for jumbo frames, because 16383 is kind of an odd size for jumbo frames. I don't really see that used. So we have the MAC constraint menu, which basically limits how many MAC addresses are allowed to be identified per port. Energy efficient Ethernet, you can enable this if you want to get a little more energy efficiency, but these switches don't really use a lot of power, as I mentioned earlier, with how much power it uses. So I don't know if it's worth enabling energy efficient Ethernet, because I know sometimes I've seen it cause problems with some of the the 2.5 gig Ethernet interfaces for software such as OpenSense, where when you're using certain hardware with the certain operating systems, that I think the port, for some reason, it would just disconnect randomly or whatever, because maybe it's trying to go into a power saving state and it wouldn't wake back up or whatever. I'm not sure what the exact issue is, but there was some kind of issue that someone said if they disabled energy efficient Ethernet, they were good to go. It might not be an issue on a network switch itself, but like on a router or something like that might be more critical. Just keep that in mind. You could try that out and see if you have any problems, and if you do, you can just disable it. So let's go to security. There's a couple menus on here. You got MAC address, which there's multiple menus, and then there's storm control. So MAC search and MAC static MAC. I should say, it's hard to say all these. So basically you can see this is the MAC address of my device I'm currently connected to, and there's a static MAC that you can looks like maybe you can assign specific MAC addresses to ports. Maybe this is how you can limit what MAC addresses are allowed on certain ports. Whereas we looked at before, the MAC address that was under the configuration for the MAC constraint was how many MAC addresses are allowed on that port, and the security one is basically which specific MAC addresses are allowed. So you can restrict what can get on the network switch a little bit that way. So that's why it's under security. Okay, so storm control, I think, helps kind of prevent issues with your network. If you have some broadcast and multicast type traffic that's flooding your network, this is supposed to limit some of that, so it doesn't like shut your network down. And network loops causes a broadcast storm essentially. So I don't know if if you don't have STP enabled, if this could limit some of that traffic. It doesn't get rid of the problem, but it kind of mitigates it a little bit. So that's what my guess is. I haven't looked into it too much, but there's some settings here that you can turn on some of the storm types that and you can limit the rate of it. So basically you're kind of minimizing the issue, but you're not getting rid of it. All right, so next we got monitoring, and you can see port statistics, and you can see how much data is going through it. So next we have tools. So we have a firmware upgrade. You can just click to upgrade that, and a configuration backup. So good to store that once you get everything how you want it, especially when you have VLAN configuration. It doesn't hurt to save it in case you have to buy another switch if this one dies or something. And then you got there's like a factory reset button and a save button and reboot and log out. So you want to make sure when you make all your changes, as with most managed network switches, you always want to save when you're done. If you reboot before you save, all your changes will most likely be lost, and they do that kind of as a safety, really, because if you hose up your network configuration on your network switch, all you gotta do is reboot it. It'll take you back to where it was working in a good state, and then you just reconfigure what you did again, hopefully correcting the problem. And then when you know everything's working good, make sure you hit save when you're done. So basically that's all there is to the web managed interface. There was more features there than I expected, so it's good to see that more features are getting into these budget-friendly devices. It's nice to see them with higher bandwidth interfaces, so we can finally move away from 1 gigabit. So if you found this interesting video that's showing two different types of switches from Sodola, they have, if you look on their site, they have more variants. They even have a 5-port that has a 10 gig over here where this blank space is. So that one's kind of interesting. It only has one 10 gig and not two like this one. So they have a bunch of different configurations. They have 8-port models that have one 10 gig like I mentioned earlier. These are nice budget-friendly switches that you can get for super cheap. I think the price difference between these might be like $10 or less. So if you're getting this switch, you might as well get 10 gig interfaces with it. I mean, you lose one of the 2.5 gig interfaces. If you have like a NAS and a PC, it's very handy to have 10 gigs to get data between the devices a lot faster. So until next time, I'll see you guys later.